And now, without further ado, I want to introduce our wonderful presenters today. We are joined by Catherine McLaughlin, certified sexuality educator. Catherine is the founder, CEO, and lead trainer for Elevatus Training. As a national expert on sexuality and IDD, she trains professionals and parents, as well as individuals, to become sexual self-advocates and peer sexuality educators. She is the author of Sexuality Education for People with Developmental Disabilities curriculum. She has developed 2 online courses, Developmental Disability and Sexuality 101 for Professionals, and Talking to Your Kids, Developmental Disabilities and Sexuality for Parents, and a 3-day certificate training, Becoming a Sexuality Educator and Trainer. She has spent her 25-plus year career committed to elevating the status of all people, which is why the name of her growing company is Elevatus Training. And you can contact Catherine at their website, and I will put that in the chat for you right now. And I also would like to introduce Morgan Hunter, whose pronouns are they, fair, and they, them. Morgan is a researcher and educator whose work focuses on centering pleasure and autonomy in the prevention of abuse of the disability community. Fair work is grounded in the principles of disability justice and trauma-informed care. Faye identifies as disabled, has 2 wonderful partners, and 2 adorable rabbits. And again, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and talking on this very important topic. And I will mute myself and let you get started. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Erin. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here today. And what we're going to be talking about is understanding ableism and feeling good about yourself, and also connecting that to sexuality and relationships. And as Erin mentioned, I'm Catherine. And Morgan, do you want to say hello?
Hi, yeah, I'm Morgan. As Erin introduced me a bit earlier, Catherine will go ahead and get started, and then I'll speak a little bit later on.
Sounds good. So the goals we have for this next hour is to understand what ableism and internalized ableism mean. We're also going to examine how ableism and internalized ableism can impact one's sexuality and relationships. And then also talk about, ways to feel good about your disability and have the relationships that you want in your life. And I'm working on a project now with the Elevatus curriculum, and Morgan's part of that. And Morgan has often brought up this idea around ableism and how it might impact people's sexuality and relationships. And so I'm really excited to have Morgan here too, excuse me, because they've been a strong advocate for this topic to be talked about. So we're going to do a quick introduction. We're going to talk about ableism and the history of ableism. And then we're going to explore some scenarios where we can identify ableism and talk about what we can do to feel better. And then we'll kind of wrap things up around things that you can do. And just a few group agreements that we like to have. Respect differences of opinion. And I'm sure that a lot of these workshops, there's talk of respecting differences of opinion. Do not yuck my yum. You may have heard that group agreement before. So to not say, ew, gross about certain things. Things will be confidential unless you tell us that you're being abused or you're abusing someone else. We're mandated reporters, so we would have to do something about that. But otherwise, we're not going to share this. This is recorded, so, there is a limit to confidentiality. And there's no such thing as a stupid question. All questions are important, and probably someone else has that question too. So if you're thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't ask that, please ask. You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand and unmute. And I'm going to pass it to Morgan, who's going to do a big piece of the information and skills.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, so for an icebreaker, and I think you all are used to just writing in the chat, so feel free to use that if that's easier. So when you hear the word ableism, what is one word you think of? And if you can think of more than one word, that's okay too, but if you, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word ableism? And then Catherine, if you want to read stuff off the chat, or I can either way. Let's see, we have ability, all right. Oppressive, freedom, okay. Wait a bit longer to see if there's any other thoughts. All right, let's go to the next slide. And if you have any other ideas that come to mind, feel free to add them to the chat. Um, what is ableism? So I'll kind of give you a definition, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about what ableism looks like. So ableism is the idea that people without disabilities are better than people with disabilities. Um, Ableism can look like ignoring what people with disabilities have to say, paying more attention to what people without disabilities have to say. So this might mean maybe like paying more attention to what a doctor says about their patient with a disability than what the patient is saying, for example. Next slide, please. A little bit more about what is ableism. So ableism can look like ignoring what people with disabilities need. So for an example, this might mean not building ramps on buildings or not spending money to hire an American Sign Language interpreter. And ableism can mean controlling what people with disabilities do. So it might mean controlling like where they live, or if they can have relationships or not, all kinds of things about their lives, like what time they go to bed, what they get to eat, things like that. So that's a little bit about what ableism is. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of ableism. That is like what ableism has looked like in the past and how we've kind of gotten to where we are now, because ableism has been around for a while. So a lot of like histories about people with disabilities have, you know, a lot of the attitudes about people with disabilities throughout history have been things like seeing them as a drain on society, or a burden, or as not being not smart or needing help, and that they cannot work. You probably encountered attitudes like this about yourself. It's not okay. Another example would be sort of the image of like the poor disabled child who needs help. There's a lot of kind of emphasis on pity, or sort of this like using someone's disability to kind of like gain attention and pity, for instance. There's a lot of kind of a lot of emphasis around that. Um, for instance, another example might be this sort of idea of avoiding talking to a person with a disability because of this idea that you might catch something from them, this idea that they might be contagious. So behavior like don't talk to her, you might get what she has. So a lot of ideas of seeing people with disabilities as being lesser than people without disabilities. This is kind of what ableism means. It doesn't mean that these things are true. These are not good things, obviously, but this is kind of how people with disabilities have been seen throughout history. Next slide, please. History of ableism number 2. So institutionalization, probably, I'm sure you're all familiar with what that means, but like things like being like locked away, not being allowed to participate in society. It might mean that people with disabilities have been excluded from really being visible or seen in society. The idea of kind of like just sweeping kind of disability under the rug. If you think of like a metaphor of like when you're cleaning a room and you just sweep stuff under the rug, that's kind of how people with disabilities have been treated throughout history. You might have the term ugly laws. There used to be laws that certain people couldn't be seen in public, and oftentimes, sorry, there's a loud car outside, and oftentimes it's applied to people with disabilities. This idea that people with disabilities shouldn't be seen publicly, and then also the history of like circuses and freak shows in circuses would oftentimes display people with disabilities um, as this as a a way for people without disabilities to sort of like look and stare at them, and if that makes sense, it's kind of like the charity and the March of Dimes a little bit. It's sort of like the feel bad for them or see them as strange or different. All right, next slide, please. So history of ableism number 3. So another part of the history of ableism is eugenics and reproduction. So that has involved a lot of forced sterilization. And by forced sterilization, I mean taking away someone's ability to ever have children. So this might mean a vasectomy for someone who has a penis, or a tubal ligation for someone who has ovaries. It might mean, and there's been a lot of like denial of human and civil rights, like taking away like the right to work or to go to school or to travel. So and I realize this is a lot of information, but just kind of thinking about that ableism throughout time has meant that the rights of people with disabilities have really been taken away and restricted. Next slide, please. All right, so that's kind of like the history of ableism and how people with disabilities have been treated in our society and still are treated. You probably know people who experience those things. You might experience them yourself. So there's 3 kind of types of ableism, if you kind of want to think about like trying to categorize it. So there's institutional ableism. If you look at the picture here, there's a picture of like a person in a wheelchair next to a bus, and the bus has a sign next to it that has like a little like line over like a wheelchair. So it's kind of indicating that the bus is not wheelchair accessible. That's kind of an example of institutional ableism. It's ableism that's kind of not like it's kind of like in the environment. It's not in the person themselves. It's sort of like the environment and the policies, the rules, the regulations. In this case, there's probably a policy that doesn't require that buses are accessible, for example. So, and oftentimes ableism can look like just not making things accessible. It might not mean that they're explicitly saying no, people with disabilities are allowed. They might just not put money into building a ramp, for example. Right, next slide, please. All right, so what is ableism? The next 2 of 9. The next is institutional, which is also outside of you. So we'll give some general examples. So buildings with inaccessible spaces. You've probably been in buildings that are less than accessible before. If you think about what kinds of things those are, like maybe there's a building that doesn't have like a button on the door to open it for someone who uses a wheelchair, for example, or maybe only the buttons on one side so they can get in but not out, and things like that. I know I've seen things like that, for example. Or it might be like like an organization might not have any policy that says that they have to provide sign language interpreters when they're requested. So things like that. Next slide, please. All right. So next type of ableism. So we're going to talk about some examples of how institutional ableism might apply to sexuality. So we think about kind of those other examples. We're kind of talking about like access to like buildings and public transit. Ableism also impacts our sexuality. Remember before I talked about like taking away people's right to have children. So institutional ableism would include things like rules for disability benefits that prevent a person from getting married, for instance, like around like SSDI or SSI. Um, laws that say it's okay to force a person with a disability to get sterilized or to take their children away if they've had children. Like maybe they're seen as not being a good parent just because they have a disability. That happens, unfortunately. Um, there might be group home rules that prevent people with disabilities from having sex, or that don't allow them to have their own bedroom. So that makes it pretty hard for them to have a sexual relationship at the group home, obviously. There might be a lack of laws to make sure that people with disabilities get to learn about sexuality. So lack of access to sex ed. All right, next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk about interpersonal ableism. So we talked about institutional ableism, which tends to be like laws and policies. And in that case, sometimes it's even just like a lack of a law or lack of a policy that gives access. Interpersonal ableism is a little different. It's also outside of the person. If you look at the picture here, there's someone sitting on a bench, and then there's people kind of like next to the person and they're pointing at the person. So interpersonal ableism is the ableism that you might experience from other people around you, not necessarily from policies or laws, but just from other people you know. And so interpersonal ableism is thoughts or beliefs that influence how people treat you and how they discriminate against you. To discriminate means to kind of like treat you as though you're less than they are. All right, next slide, please. So interpersonal ableism, here are some examples. Interpersonal ableism might be things like calling someone with a disability a name, like, you know, like using kind of like mean words to refer to them. I'm sure like you can think of like ableist slurs that people might get called. Those would be an example of interpersonal ableism. Or using baby talk with someone who's not actually a baby. Baby talk is when someone kind of like their voice gets really high pitched or kind of sing-songy in the way that you might talk to a small infant. Another example might be like always helping them because they think the person is needy or weak, even if the person doesn't want help. And so sort of like forcing help on someone who doesn't really want it. That could also be an example of interpersonal ableism. Another example might be like if like people you know, like family members, if they don't prioritize making their homes accessible to you, or they don't consider your needs, like your access needs, for example, like if they like if people around you think, oh, it doesn't matter if this person is not able to like, you know, get their wheelchair into this building, or it doesn't matter if this person is allergic to the fragrance that I use, I'm going to keep doing it. So things like that. All right. So a couple more interpersonal examples, in this case about sexuality. Some interpersonal examples of how some examples of how interpersonal ableism might show up around sexuality could be things like people assuming that a person with a disability is not interested in sex, or they might or alternatively, they might assume that a person with a disability is too interested in sex, or they might call them hypersexual and try to take away their right to have sex ed. So you might experience either of those. Another example could be making a big deal out of someone asking a person with a disability to prom. You've probably seen things on social media where it's like, oh, this is so wonderful. The student who doesn't have a disability asked the student with a disability to prom. Isn't that a great, kind thing that they did? I mean, you just have to think about it. It's like, well, I mean, people ask people to prom all the time. Why is it a big deal that the one student has a disability, you know? That doesn't mean that they're doing, maybe the student with the disability is doing the other student a favor. How do we know? I mean, so the idea that that asking the student with a disability to prom is somehow like doing them a favor, or it's like an act of charity, because there's this idea that they like that no one would want to date them, is ableism and interpersonal ableism in this example. So the idea of like not wanting to date a person with a disability, or kind of treating people with disability as being inherently undesirable as relationship partners. I know that that's something like a lot of people experience, myself certainly, as a disabled person. Also, I'd say assuming that people with disabilities are always cisgender and straight, or that that people with disabilities are not able to identify and know their sexual orientation or gender. Is also an example of interpersonal ableism. All right, so next we're on to sexuality and relationships. So how does ableism outside of you impact your sexuality and relationships? All right, so I'm gonna get a drink of water first. Here, doing a lot of talking.
I just realized, were we supposed to pose that question? Or is that just a intro?
We could, I can't remember. I think it's just an intro. All right, so I talked a lot about different forms of ableism, and given a lot of examples of like how different types of ableism, we'll talk more about the internalized ableism later on, but the institutional ableism, which is like laws and policies, and then interpersonal ableism, which is how like other people treat you. I've talked a bit about how those two things can impact like how people see the sexuality of people with disabilities. So now I'm going to talk a bit about kind of like how this is impacting people with disabilities. When you think about someone who's experiencing all of these negative messages from policies in their society or from people around them. So here are some of the impacts. So the supporters might not help people with disabilities form relationships, or they might be overly protective rather than providing education about sexuality. There might be this idea that providing sexuality education could give people ideas to become sexually active, as though that's a bad thing and not a normal part of life. People with disabilities might be removed from sexuality classes so that they don't learn information about sex. People might not see people with disabilities as good partners or as attractive. I think I mentioned that that was kind of a common thing. And that in some cases that could also be related to institutional ableism of taking away someone's children because they're not seen as being a good parent. People with disabilities might receive messages like your needs are not valid, you're not attractive. And unfortunately, a lot of people internalize these messages, and it's kind of hard not to when you receive these things all your life. And this is, kind of just the air that you breathe. Next slide, please. And so that brings us to the third and final type of ableism, which is internalized ableism. And if you look at the little picture here where the arrow is pointing, there's a person who's kind of like sitting with like their hand sort of like resting on like their knees. And they're thinking at the thought bubble, and there's like a kind of like black scribbly lines inside of their the thought bubble. They're thinking it's like they're thinking about all of the ableist things that people have said to them. So internalized ableism that's inside of you is believing the thoughts and beliefs of ableism about yourself. And so internalized ableism is what happens when institutional ableism and interpersonal ableism kind of like cause a person to think that all those bad things that people say about them might be true, even though they're not. But unfortunately, that happens a lot. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of internalized ableism. Thinking you are not smart, feeling you're a burden and should not ask for your access needs to be met. It might mean having low self-esteem, or it might mean feeling like no one wants you around. And again, that doesn't mean that any of these things are true. These are just things that people like might have told you, and so you started believing them for no fault of your own. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. here are some examples of how internalized ableism might affect how someone thinks about their sexuality. It might mean thinking that they cannot have relationships. It might mean thinking that they deserve to be treated poorly if they're in a relationship. It might mean thinking that they cannot have standards in a relationship, or thinking that like, oh, well, like I'd like a partner who doesn't cheat on me, but like I don't know if I can really ask for them to, honor that commitment. It might mean feeling ashamed of having any sort of sexual desire, or feeling like they don't deserve pleasure. Next slide, please. Um, Here are some results of internalized ableism on one's sexuality. It might mean blaming yourself, like when others treat you poorly, you might think it is my fault. I deserve to be treated poorly. You might stay in or anyone who experiences internalized ableism might stay in a bad relationship, or might settle for less, thinking that you can't do better. The thing that you might think it is better than being alone. Like if you're told that that no one wants to be with you, that can make it really scary to leave a partner who doesn't treat you well if you think that you don't have any other options for dating someone. And it might mean being used to doing what other people want, even if it feels wrong, because like maybe you've been forced to go along with what other people want all your life. Or it might mean saying yes, even when you don't want to. And so in the context of a relationship, that might mean like, like saying yes to something that someone wants, or saying yes to something sexually that someone else wants, even if it's not what you want. All right, next slide, please. All right, some more results of internalized ableism on one's sexuality. Difficulty telling people what your access needs are. And so an example here is saying something like, I could never tell them what I want sexually. It's like a really big, important part of having a sexual relationship of any kind is being able to tell someone what you want. And so if you feel like your needs are not important and your access needs in sex are not important, that might mean that it feels like you can't tell people those things, which is really unfortunate, because then it's hard to actually have your needs met. It might result in difficulty healing from abuse and trauma. An example being like, I will always be damaged goods and can never heal, or I feel sad and worthless. And again, that doesn't mean that these things are true, but just that these might be feelings that someone has. A person might feel like they don't deserve love, that they are not attractive or desirable, or that they can't be a good partner. And so you might like someone might feel things like, no one will ever love me. And again, not that that's true, of course. And next slide is results of internalized ableism, 3 of 3. This could also include things like thinking that people without disabilities are better than you. And remember that we were defining ableism as the idea that people without disabilities are better than people with disabilities. And so you might start to believe that as a result of ableism. And again, for no fault of your own. And so someone might only want to date people who don't have disabilities, even if that's not what they really want. Or they might only date people with disabilities, even if that's not what they want. So they might say, I can only be with a person with a disability, or they might say, I'm only dating you because I cannot date someone without a disability. And this might mean hurting other people with disabilities by thinking that they are not as good as people without disabilities. And so it's sort of like this idea of, if all people with disabilities are thinking, oh, well, people without disabilities are better than us, but we can't date them, so we will settle for dating each other. So it kind of hurts everyone. This is something I've definitely seen a lot as a disabled person myself, but all right. So, if Catherine, I forget where you're studying in, but I can keep going if that.
Yeah, you're going to do the scenario. So you do the recognize.
Okay. All right, sounds good. So, what do you do? Kind of, and again, like, it's no fault of anyone's if they have internalized ableism. This is just the society that we live in. We can't control the messages that we receive for everyone, but we can try to recognize, these things and do something. So, we have here some steps to feeling good. So step number 1 is recognize the ableism and internalize ableism. So that's the things that we were kind of just talking about earlier, thinking about kind of like what are all the messages that I've received about myself or about sexuality in particular, because this is a presentation about sexuality and ableism. So just identifying what those things are, identifying what you've been taught to think about yourself. Um, and are those things that you really want to believe? Like, are those things that you actually, like maybe you're not sure where this idea came from, but it doesn't feel good. Start to kind of like think about these sorts of messages that you've been told. Step number 2 is unlearn those negative messages and replace them with positive self-talk messages. And we'll get a little bit more into kind of like examples of that. And then step number 3 is get support from other self-advocates, because it's hard to do all this work alone. And it's much easier to do this with other people who are in the process of healing from internalized ableism. All right, next slide, please. Right, so activity 2, so scenarios. So a person with a disability asks for an interpreter to access a sexuality education class. The class organizers say, no, we cannot provide that, even though they have the funds to do so. So then in the chat, if you want to kind of like put your answers, question number 1 is, what is ableist about this scenario? So if you just want to take a moment and think about it, what is ableist about this scenario? Let's see. I can read it again if that's helpful. A person with a disability asks for an interpreter to access a sexuality education class. The class organizers say, no, we cannot provide that, even though they have the funds to do so. So we have an answer, I'm not giving access to everyone. Yeah, so just denying access is ableism. Yeah. Any other thoughts about what is ableist about this scenario? Refusing the accommodation, yes. So yeah, we talked earlier about kind of like how oftentimes ableism can look like just kind of not prioritizing the needs of people with disabilities, or kind of thinking that it's not important to put money into hiring interpreters and things like that. All right, next question is, what might this person with a disability believe about themselves? And this might be a little bit kind of trickier. It's not necessarily in the scenario, but if you think about kind of internalized ableism, what might someone think about themselves as a result of some sexuality educators saying that they can't provide, an interpreter for them to take the class? They might think, I don't matter, or I am not sexual. Yeah, they might start to think that their needs don't matter because they went ahead and they advocated for what they needed, and then they were told no. Yeah, they might feel not worthy of the service and not important enough. All of these kinds of things. Yeah, so and then in this case, like the serve, or like I'm not worthy of kind of like receiving sexuality education. I'm not important enough to receive sexuality education. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right, let's do the next slide, please. Okay, so scenario number 1. What would you tell a friend who had this experience? So imagine that like this was your friend who asked for an interpreter for this class, and then they were told no. So what would you tell your friend? And imagine that your friend is feeling, that they don't matter, that they're not important enough, that they're not worthy. You'd mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, yeah, and so that this is their right. They have a right to an accommodation. And that's really important. First, reassure them the Navy help find an advocate. So yeah, help them kind of like think about ways of advocating for their needs. That's really important. Maybe like reassure them that this is not their fault and that they are important, they are worthy of getting sex ed. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. All right, activity 2, so scenario 2. A person of color with a disability is learning about relationships, but is removed from class when the content demonstration is done because, quote, someone in the class is saying, or maybe a teacher or someone is saying, we don't want to give them ideas. And so in this instance, there's racism as well as ableism happening. Can you identify like what is kind of like ableist, or in this case, like both ableist and racist about this scenario? Not included with everyone else. Yeah, so this person is a person of color with a disability is not being included with everyone else. Yeah, definitely removed from the class. Thinking they would put the thought in their head from bringing up the topic is ableist. Yeah, and the racist part might be because people of color who also have a disability have been particularly likely to be seen as being hypersexual and of kind of like of their sexuality being dangerous, and so like might be more likely to be denied kind of access to sexuality education for that reason. And so kind of like it's important to think about how like racism might kind of impact how someone with a disability is affected as well. So we also have not only being included, but physically separated. Yeah. All right, what might this person with a disability believe about themselves as a result of this? Oh, and we also have thinking that they can't handle or learn about relationships is infantilism. Yep. So what might this person believe about themselves as a result of this experience? They might think that they shouldn't be in a relationship, they aren't good enough for a relationship. The person's feeling left out. Yeah, all of these things. That there's something wrong with them. Yeah. They might feel like there's something different about them. Yeah. You're doing really great. Let's move on to the next slide. So imagine that this person is your friend. What would you tell them if they if this person was your friend and had this experience? Oh, Catherine, would you go back? I think it went forward. Um, they might say, I'd say you can try joining a better class. Oh, Catherine, you're muted, by the way.
I don't know what just happened.
Yeah, the share stopped. Oh, and we also have they can and should learn about relationships and give them resources. Yeah, so this was your friend. You might try to think about other like resources that you can like give this person if they're being denied sexuality education, or try to like find like a better class that will allow them to be part of it. Yeah. You'd recommend elevators training. Yeah, I think you can also find common demonstration videos on YouTube. So like there's other like lots of like resources like for that particular topic.
One of the handouts is a resource list that does have some of those
Mhm.
as well.
All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. Scenario 3. All right, so a person with a disability asks someone out on a date, and the person says, I might go out with you, but can you even have sex? So, whoops. There you go. So what is ableist about this scenario?
And I apologize. I just put all of the handouts in the chat too for everybody to take, and I can post them at the end as well so that they're easily visible.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah. So what is ableist about this scenario? The person with a disability asks someone out on a date, and the person says, I might go out with you, but can you even have sex? The person with a disability being unsure about sex. Someone with a disability can't have sex, assuming they cannot be intimate because of their disability. Yeah, so there's this idea that and people will, and I'm sure you probably encountered things like this, but this idea that that people with disabilities cannot be sexually active, yeah, is an example of ableism. And what might the person with a disability believe about themselves after this experience? They might feel unworthy, they might feel self-conscious. Yeah, they might be like worried about asking anyone out again if people are going to say something like that. Um, they might feel like they shouldn't have sex, so that people don't want to be intimate with them because of their disability. Exactly. They might feel offended. I mean, that's a pretty offensive thing to say to someone. I mean, unfortunately, that does happen. I'm sure you've, either if not experienced it yourself, have probably known people who've had things like that said to them. Um, yeah. So yeah, they might feel like kind of afraid of ever asking someone out again because they don't know what sort of comments they'll get about their disability. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. So imagine that this person was your friend. What would you tell them after they had this experience? You'd say, I'm sorry that person's uneducated, yeah, that they don't understand that people with disabilities can have sex. Yeah. So try to convince the person it's not their fault. Yeah. Anything else you'd want to say to this person if they were your friend? I say to a friend that let your date know that you're not ready for sex right now. Okay. Yeah, definitely. If you're not feeling like you're ready for sex, yeah, you should let your date know that. That is someone they wouldn't want to spend time with either without more conversations or educations. Yeah, so yeah, not to blame themselves, but this is, the person they asked out was clearly someone who um, needed more education. I have my friends Erica. Reassure them that they're worthy, definitely.
I'm not sure we have enough time to do all the scenarios, so.
Okay, yeah, we can skip the rest of them. All right. So we're gonna talk a little bit about power. And the slides I think will be shared later, so you can kind of like read through the other scenarios and kind of like think about them. So our society gives certain people power. Power means that we listen to them more, treat them with more respect, focus on their needs, give them more choices, which can make their life easier. People who are not disabled tend to have more power than those who are disabled or who have a disability. Ableism is a form of having less power and being treated unfairly because of your disability. We've got a lot of examples we listed kind of like, like kind of illustrated that for, like not being allowed to have children, not being able to decide where you live, things like that. Everyone should have equal power, but there are certain groups of people who tend to have more power than others. Here are some people. So people who tend to have more power, and this is listed as social power, are people with white skin color, heterosexual or straight. So for instance, like a man who is attracted to women or a woman who's attracted to men. People who are cisgender, that is their gender identity matches what gender they were given to them when they were born. People who are Christian, that is they celebrate Christmas and Easter. People who are not disabled, who do not have a disability, physical or intellectual, people who are thin and beautiful, who look like celebrities, that is, who look like famous people. If you think kind of like a lot of celebrities tend to be thin and conventionally attractive. People who are rich or have lots of money, people who are adults but not old with gray hair, so kind of adults of a certain age, man, so not a woman or not non-binary. So these are some examples of categories of people who tend to have more power. So you can see here, like you could be someone, you could have a disability, but then they can maybe have a little bit of power in one area, or you might have like not much power in any of these areas, or you might have a lot of power in all of these areas. So there's a lot of different ways that people might experience kind of like having or not having power. Next slide, please. All right, and then we have here on the screen an illustration of kind of like who has power and who does not have power. On the top, there's some pictures of some people standing on a little like pillar, and it says society gives them social power at the top of the little pillar, and there's like a star above, I think, their heads. It says white, men, some women, rich, non-disabled, thin / beautiful, adult but not too old, heterosexual, cisgender, and Christian. So they look kind of like, I think Catherine had mentioned earlier, that they look sort of like Disney characters, a lot of them. If you think about what Disney, a lot of kind of like, maybe not like recent Disney characters, but kind of like Disney characters of like the 90s a lot, 90s and aughts. And then we have kind of like below them, we have everyone else. And so Black, Brown, Asian, Latino, women, poor, cognitive, physical disabilities, mental ill health, overweight or obese, not classically beautiful, transgender, lesbian, gay, Muslim, Jewish. So someone might experience, I think when we listed that example earlier where there was like racism as well as ableism. And so there's lots of different like parts of our identities that might impact how people treat us. And ableism is just one of them. All right, and so the reality is that like we should all be equal. And there's a picture here of like all the people kind of like standing on the grass, and there's no pillar that elevates some of them above others. It says, and then the caption says, we are working towards all of us having social power. We aren't all treated well, given choices, and our lives are fair. So if you kind of think about that as like a goal and like how that might impact your own sexuality, the sexuality of other like people who you know, this is kind of like sort of like our objective and kind of like what we are kind of like hoping for is all people being able to have social power and being treated well and given choices and being treated fairly. Right. All right, so just do a little review of the steps to feeling good. So the first step is recognizing ableism and internalized ableism. The next step is unlearning negative messages and replacing them with positive self-talk messages. And then the third step is getting support from other self-advocates.
I think this is where I come in.
All right.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. And Morgan mentioned this earlier too, that it's hard to overcome ableism and internalized ableism. And so I've spent some time talking to some self-advocates about ideas they had to challenge ableism. And one of them was just really thinking about those messages that you're getting. And Morgan mentioned that in the different scenarios, these messages people were getting and changing those, trying to unlearn them. And it might be a lifelong process to try to unlearn them. When you live in an ableist culture, it's coming at you all the time. But you can change the thoughts. Sometimes people even picture something surrounding them that blocks those messages. So they bounce off and they don't get into you. But you can say things to yourself like, I deserve as much as anyone else. My type of communication is normal. I have the right to speak up if I have pleasure needs, things that make me feel good, sexually and in relationships, sensory needs, or any kind of needs. I have the right to speak up. I deserve pleasure in my life and in my relationships. I'm desirable and attractive. I am not a burden. I deserve these things, even if others do not let me or support me. I still deserve these things. And the traumatic experience I had was not my fault. Or if I have internalized ableism, it's not my fault. It's been sort of given to me. And I can heal and have positive relationships. So sometimes thinking different thoughts, because those thoughts in our head can really influence how we feel about ourselves. So try to unlearn those as best you can. And then we wanted to ask you, what would you say to someone with a disability about how to push back on internalized ableism, how to keep it out of you? What are some things you would suggest doing? And you can put those in the chat. What can you do so that you don't let those messages come in and make you feel bad or worthless or sad? Or what can you do to prevent that? Give you a minute to think about that and put your ideas in the chat. Remind them why they are awesome. So remembering why you're awesome, write down all the awesomeness about you. Be there for anyone, or reach out to others to get support. Yeah, so being there for others, but also when you need support, like, that didn't go well that date. I'm just probably not attractive, and then you go to people that are going to build you up, lift you up. Other ideas around what you could say to someone with a disability? Someone talk to a teacher. Yeah, so you find that person that really lifts you up too. Yeah. Some of the self-advocates said, ableism is real, and, being able to recognize it and be like, oh, that's ableism. I don't need to believe that or think that about myself. I'd say to try to make better things happen. Yeah. So, right. What can you do to make better things happen and feel good about yourself and understand others' opinions don't define you? That's right. So that idea of, no, I'm not going to provide an ASL interpreter because you don't really need this. That's not true. And Morgan said that a lot. A lot of these messages are just not true. And we can say, that's about them and their beliefs. That's not about me. Great. So it's not easy, but important to think about, how can I feel better, or what is some advice for people with disabilities to lift themselves up? And then here are a few resources, some articles that you might find really interesting. And you have all the slides. So if you want to try to look up some of these articles. We also included in the handouts, and Erin put them in the chat, a disability pride toolkit as well. Thank you, Erin. So lots of resources to help figure out ways to lift others up or lift yourself up. And talking with other self-advocates gives us a lot of power too. Just because our society doesn't put us up on the pedestal, doesn't mean we can't think of ourselves as equal to others and talk with others about that. And if we could, because we just have 2 minutes left, if you could tell us one thing you're planning to do or one thing you could do to reduce your chances of being ableist to yourself, internalized thinking all those messages out in the ableist culture. What's something you can do to protect yourself or reduce your chances of believing those things? What's one thing you could do moving forward?
One thing I'd want to kind of like encourage folks to think of for this one is like imagine, because sometimes it's easier for us to say mean things about ourselves than it is to say mean things about our friends. And so if you're thinking something about yourself, to think like, would I say that to a friend?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great tip. Right, and we never would, right? Yeah, so sort of treating yourself like a friend. And another thing is practice self-care, words of affirmation. Yeah, so taking care of ourselves, valuing ourselves, making ourselves feel special, practice positive self-thinking, put away trash. We could even think of, if this is what you mean, that these messages are trash and we'll just put them away in the garbage can and get rid of them. Yeah, great. So thank you all. We have a few more slides, but what I want to really show you, these are just more about what Elevatus does, but this is our contact information if you want to reach out to either of us. And we only have 1 minute left, but I wanted to tell you that the project that Morgan and I are working on, we are looking for self-advocates 18 to 26 years old to become part of a class, a 6-week class this summer. And one of the classes is on ableism and sexuality, but lots of other topics, because we want to get your input on what you think of these lessons. So if that's something you're interested in, we'll pay you as well to attend those classes and tell us what you think. And then one thing in the chat, that depend on what I do to prevent ableism for myself. So that depends on what I would do. Yeah. Yes. So if anyone's interested, I will pass the fly, or you can put your email in the chat and we'll reach out to you. Or I can pass the flyer along to Erin if you want to be part of this class and earn some money, because we really value your ideas and perspective.
I
So
will
Erin.
also happily take it in case anybody reaches out after.
Okay, great. And I see somebody in there and I'll copy that as well. So thanks, everyone. It looks like we're just going over time, but if people do want to learn more about that 6-week class, put your email in or Erin will send a flyer to you as well.
This,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you so much. This was so informative, and I know we could have multiple trainings on this. As I said previously, this webinar is recorded, so it will be up on our website along with all of the handouts that are in the chat. So if you want to go back over anything, and I recommend watching this again and going over the handouts because it's a very important topic, they will be on our website under our webinars section. So, and again, thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you, Catherine. This was amazing, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to have you talk about this today.
Great. Thank you.
I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.